So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name's Charlotte Mitchell, and I'm the Director of Communications and Membership here at the LRG. You're joining us for the event Conservation and Multispecies Relations in Contemporary European Tourism Environment, which is a special launch event for Landscape Research, Volume 47, Issue 7. We've got a fascinating event ahead of us today where we're going to be joined by Eva Bergland, Carolyn Martins, both of whom are the editors for the special edition. We've got Julia Lahus, Jonas Plan, who is going to be joining us by phone out in the field somewhere, I hear, Alessandro Ripa and Lydia Ratmanova. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping to let you know that the event will be recorded and put up on our website at a later date. So if you don't want to appear on camera, that's absolutely fine. You can just turn your camera off. We'll start with a quick introduction from our special issue editors, Carolyn and Eva, followed by 5-minute presentations from each of our contributors. Throughout this process, if you have any questions, please make a note of them and add them to the chat, and we'll get to these questions at the end of our session. So lastly, just before we get started, I'd like to encourage those of you who are yet to join our landscape community here at LRG to consider doing so. We're a registered charity. We've been around since 1967. And everything we do is for the benefit of our members and to advance cross-disciplinary landscape research within the global community, as well as access to our peer-reviewed journal, Landscape Research. There's a whole host of other benefits too, including network opportunities, discounts, events, access to our research fund, and excitingly, also the opportunity to join our critical field study, which we launched yesterday, which is in September, and it's going to Cairo. And it really promises to be a very kind of rich and rewarding academic pursuit for those that are involved. So with no further ado, I'll stop talking and I'll hand over to Eva and Carolyn to get started.
Yes, hello from me. I'm Carolyn Mertens. I am currently affiliated with the University of Munich, and I am one of the editors of the special issue. And I first want to thank you very much for joining us today, for giving us your time and attention, and for your interest in our work. I am going to give a brief first introduction to it. So our aim or our research work is or has been aimed at first understanding how nature conservation and tourism development interplay in remote places in Europe. And secondly, our research seeks to shed light on the particular landscapes that both precede from such dynamics as well as emerge from them. So now, before Eva and I delve deeper into these topical fields, I would like to briefly point out that this special issue is an outcome of the AeroNet funded research project. Slide, please. That is called Contours, Remoteness, and do we have the slide? Sorry. We have the rest of it. So the project was called Contours, Remoteness, Conservation, Tourism, as part of which the authors of this special issue met and carried out their research projects. The project ran from 2021 to 2023 and sought to investigate the nexus of conservation and tourism in remote places in Europe. And as a consortium, Contours initially brought together 12 researchers from 4 European universities located in Oulu, Finland, in Tallinn, Estonia, in Munich, Germany, and also in St. Petersburg in Russia, as well as a few more collaborators that we met along the way. Now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24 and 22, all collaborations with Russian institutions were cancelled, and our cooperation with our colleagues who were based in Russia at the time was put on hold. This has affected us deeply on a personal level and also as a research collective. However, 2 of our colleagues were able to relocate to academic homes outside of Russia, while Lydia Rachmanova, present today, agreed to publish her research material that she compiled before February 22 as independent scholar. I mentioned this here explicitly to make transparent how the special issue has been in fact affected by geopolitical repercussions of the war on Ukraine, and also to point out the personal challenges under which Lydia has continued to work on this joint publication. At this point, thank you, Lydia. And for more information, please visit the project website that you see shared here on the slide. And I hand it over to Eva for now.
Thank you. Yes, and my name is Eva Berglund. I was the other editor of the special issue, and I just want to briefly mention some of the issues that we picked up, looking at multi-species relations, particularly in connection with tourism and conservation in remote places. And what I found interesting, and I think we all did, were some of the similarities in the ways that particularly discussions about megafauna like bears. In this picture here, we see a bear similar to one that apparently killed a jogger in the Italian Alps in 2023. And understandably, these kinds of situations provoke very unhappy public situations, which we wanted to look at, in addition to lots of other issues that come across as quite similar in the various field locations, which were remote, possibly considered marginal, and where instead of other kinds of economic activities, nature tourism seemed to be something that would be a good thing for a local community. And so what's interesting was the similarities between those, the European Alps, Eastern Germany, Estonian, Finnish, Russian countryside, all very different contexts. And yet, when we looked at landscape and the concept of multi-species studies, we found interesting similarities and ways to actually bounce ideas and thoughts and insights off of each other. And as scholars, we wanted to complicate matters rather than coming up with the stereotyped media representations that you see here, and to come up with a conceptual language. And I think we found that the landscape vocabulary was very useful to us, even though that wasn't where many of us came from. Also, we noted that the multi-species vocabulary, which is very much in vogue in humanities and social sciences, of course, has a much longer history and very rich history that we could perhaps draw from in the natural sciences. So the critical social science fashion is perhaps something that could be enriched by different kinds of discourses. Over to you, Carolyn.
So a few more words on landscape and how we engaged it and in fact engaged with it. So as stated previously, we were interested in landscape regarding its remaking and reimagining in the context of nature conservation and tourism. And more precisely, in the relationship between development of specific forms of tourism on the one hand, and particular understandings of and practices that were aimed at nature conservation or restoration. And how this relationship is or had been envisioned came into play is complex, dynamic, and context-specific, as the different papers in our collection demonstrate. And moreover, landscape, here understood as plural, emerges as distinctively historical form from the specific relationships between humans and non-humans that have constituted in the first place. The landscapes we have encountered in our field sites were many. For instance, there was a rural working landscapes that have historically been maintained as curated landscapes to sustain livelihoods and that were also appreciated as such. Then there were seemingly pristine landscapes that were envisioned as genuinely natural and unharmed by human presence. We also encountered industrial landscapes of destruction and pollution that were deemed to recover. And finally, we also met landscapes of war and terror that refused to gloss over historical atrocities to produce only recreational experiences in the context of nature tourism. These different landscape configurations shaped the ways in which conservation or restoration, as well as tourism, produced specific visions and practices of regional development. In the Italian Alps, rewilding was experienced as the loss of a working landscape and cultural history, a loss further accentuated by the promotion of nature tourism. In contrast, at the White Sea, the unlocking of nature tourism potential was hoped for, providing the means to preserve a working relationship with the landscape. In the context of recreational activities in snow, then, landscape is rendered as natural environment, including its non-human inhabitants, and, as such, fostered the establishment of regulated engagement as well as non-compliance with the rules. In not so pristine, but nevertheless attractive forests in Finland, the promotion of nature tourism allows to sustain livelihoods in remote areas shaped by a history of forest industry. In Eastern Germany, the post-industrial landscape has been turned into a pretty lakeland and tourist destination, indicating both ecological recovery and successful political transformation. And finally, along the Ob River in Russia, landscape restoration and preservation form memorial practices and therefore political interventions. And back to Eva.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm really having strange trouble getting into the next slide. But I'll stop sharing and carry on without the slide. The final concept that we wanted to introduce in this introduction was the concept of infrastructure, which we found in many different shapes in our work, and in particular in the infrastructure of tourism. And in my slide, I had images of different brochures, which basically show, again, a visual, a kind of representations of very similar kinds of attractions, which include this multi-species element, but from particular lenses. And yet we found that ourselves asking, what could be more designed than a tourism landscape? So whilst the landscape of nature tourism has very much to the fore, the nature itself is supposedly untouched, there is, of course, a whole wealth of designed and infrastructurally, technically created work underlying it, which changes over history. And it was that temporal dimension that we thought was interesting and, of course, varied, and that is also going to have to be redesigned as different kinds of livelihoods in our locations go forward in time. And I hope basically with this final concept, thinking of the concept of infrastructure, that you'll agree that we managed to get quite interesting and new insights into the combinations of all of these conceptual vocabularies, languages about multi-species, about infrastructure, about tourism, without any of us being specifically experts in any of those fields. And that was all I think Carolyn and I had as an introduction. We really hope that the presentations then whet your appetite to read the rest of the special issue. And if the sharing is working for you, Carolyn, I'll invite Alessandra then. Alessandra Ripa, maybe you can just introduce yourself, also your affiliation, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Charlotte, for organizing, for hosting, and really thanks a lot to Carolyn and Eva for having not only sort of put together the special issue, but sort of really sort of shepherded us all together throughout several months and various meetings, and this has been extremely insightful and it's been a really great process. And I'm very pleased with the outcome. I'll just briefly, well, I'm an anthropologist. I'm based at the University of Oslo currently. Previously, having been based for a few years at the Richard Carson Center in Munich, which is where the German component of the Contours project was based. And the paper I've written is called "Where Tourism Fails: The Unmaking of a Post-Working Landscape in the Italian Alps." And it's basically trying to make a little bit of sense of the landscape that you are looking at in this picture here. This is a valley in northern Italy. It's a valley very close to where I grew up. It's a valley where part of my family has a history, and so it's a bit of there's a personal connection to me here, and it's a place where I've been not been doing research until fairly recently. I've done most of my previous work in China and Southeast Asia on issues of infrastructure, border trade, and a few other things. And I've sort of returned home, so to say, with my interest quite recently. And I found a place that struck me after having been away for many years. That struck me as marginal in a particular sense of the word. You can remain, well, it's okay. You can remain with that picture for now. Thanks. Marginal, not so much geographically, and of course, we know from the scholarship that these notions of marginality or remoteness even are always, in a way, sort of relative. But it's marginal, not geographically, because if you look at it on the map, it's fairly much in the heart of Europe. It's fairly close to you know, a number of tourist destination towns, you know, infrastructure that connects, for example, Germany with Italy, the main sort of highway connecting the sort of Germany through Austria and Italy passes not far from here, but it's marginal in the sense that there is no significant economic activity in the valley. It's a place that over 1,000 people lives here, but it's basically an extended suburb to so the larger town, which is in its vicinity, and people commute essentially. They spend you know, an hour in the car every day to go and work in the valley, as they would say. Which means the bigger valley, and then they return up in the mountains in the evening, right? And it has this. It is a place that is certainly lived, but that is does not really have any sort of economic activity of any significance, and because of that, and because of the abandonment of mountain agriculture that was prevalent here as everywhere else in the Alps until 50 years ago or so. You see the landscape as it is now. This is a forest landscape, which would have been very different 50 years ago. You also have a sort of constant, sort of ongoing depopulation of the valley, which has been ongoing for many, many decades. And you have the contested return of wildlife with wolves and more recently bears that Eva mentioned earlier. And for me, the question of tourism was interesting, and it's something that I haven't really thought about before, and I'm really grateful for the work that we have done as part of the Contours project, because it really brought up this question for me. Not so much in terms of why is there no tourism here, but what I was quite trying to capture was the reason why most of my interlocutors here showed a certain, the best way I can still define it is a reluctance. There is a reluctancy towards tourism in the valley. There was a sense of not of active resistance. Many people were sort of, in a way, sort of almost hoping for more tourists, that there would be more economic activities and so on and so forth. But there was at the same time a sense that this was not really going to work out, and there was almost a sense of this might actually not be all that good for the valley. And now you can go to the next slide, sorry, if you don't mind. And I sort of realized that in order to answer this question, I had to make sense of landscapes such as those that I would like to show you in the next slides, which is what you couldn't see in the previous picture, but you can see in this picture because it was taken in the winter. And you can see all of those lines in the landscape. And these are formerly terraced fields, which have been now sort of covered by forest because they are not used for agricultural purposes anymore. And so under the layers of recently sort of reforested landscape, you have this history which is very much present in the local memory, as what I taken from biology and other work in environmental history that I call a working landscape. But of course, not being in use anymore, but still being very much present in everyday's life and in memories and the way people identify with the valley. I call it a post-working landscape, in that it's something that is present and absent in significant ways. And I think that's the key to understand that sort of reluctancy towards nature tourism in particular, and that sense of almost distress with which sort of people encounter outsiders who come into the valley and say, "Oh, this is so beautiful," like this is this sort of natural enchanted landscape. Whereas for them, the value is not in nature, is not in the landscape, is not in its sort of perceived wilderness, but it's in the history of labor that went into it, which is quite often personal, which is tied to family and memories and places specifically. And that history of labor, that is, or at least is perceived to be impossible to convey to sort of an outsider tourist. I think that's the place to look at for that sense of reluctancy towards tourism. Or at least that's the kind of argument that I try to make in the paper. And if you could go to the final slide, I just say one more thing before thanking you on some of the methods that I use. And I would say that the main methods was doing, like in this picture, hanging out with a couple of hunters who were going on a hunting trip. And I think the walking throughout the valley, the walking alongside people who walk it and really sort of pay attention to it regularly and almost if not daily, certainly weekly. And in the walking, recounting all of those histories of the landscape that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and that I could sort of see through their eyes and memories. I think that was the method that stood out for me in this context. So thank you very much, and please feel free to reach out to me. And you can find my email on my website at University of Oslo if you have questions or if you'd like to discuss anything, if we don't have time to do so later.
Thank you, Ale. Wonderful. Our next speaker today is Julia Lajus, who is co-writing with Alexei Krajkovsky, and Julia is joining us today from Washington. So, Carolyn, you will be sharing the slides.
We were trying to do it this way. That works. Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Should work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the project and to the editors of the special issue, Caroline and Eva, with all the joint work that we were able to do in a very difficult circumstances. As you know, Caroline already explained, the whole project was not, didn't go like we expected because first of the COVID and then because of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So we never met in the field as we proposed and hoped, but at least we did this collaborative work for the special issue, which we very much appreciate. So this is our paper, The Road Along the Coast, Infrastructure, Nature, Tourism and Cultural Heritage on the White Sea, co-written by my dear colleague Alexei Krajkovsky and myself. And the White Sea area is the area which we studied as a historians, we're environmental historians, we studied most of our professional life. But with this project, we did a new type of research, and we combined historical research with the field research, with qualitative semi-conductive interviews when we met people and talked with them. And so please show the second slide. We worked on the northern coast of the White Sea. It's a little bit above the Arctic Circle, but not very much. It's subarctic. And as you see from this map, all coastal settlements along this northern coast of the White Sea are connected by one road that parallel the sea. The road, the distance is 250 kilometers, so it's pretty long road. Historically, this road can run closer to the littoral, but even now in some places it comes very much to the coast, while in other places it runs maybe on 10 kilometers from the coast. And it's a very variable landscape, from forested and rocked places in the west to more flat and seashore sea landscape on the east. Compared to many areas in Russia's Far East or Siberia, the White Sea coast cannot be considered really remote because it can be reachable from main cities, from the north, from Murmansk, and also from St. Petersburg and other cities. But you know, people coming here, tourists who are coming here, they find here northern wilderness that appears exotic. So it's a coast that only recently became available for tourists, and its availability is very much connected with the road. Because historically all the transportation here went by water, and this place could be considered as roadless for many centuries that were inhabited by people. Please, second slide, another slide. The eastern end of this road, which is still in some places under construction, as you see on this slide on the corner. So where, you know, the pavement can be distorted and then it started again. And the eastern end of this road leads to a unique ensemble of wooden churches in the village of Varzuga, which is one of the very important heritage site, and it definitely attracts people, attracts tourists to come and to visit. And transportation along the coast evolved over centuries of mutual influence between human societies and land and seascapes, and waterways had been vital to these networks, as I already told. And despite the importance of cultural heritage, most visitors come not solely for this cultural experience, or sometimes completely they didn't know about that and they discovered this cultural experience only when they came to the region. They came mostly to fish for salmon, and here this multi-species interaction also became important. We didn't consider that too much in this particular paper because we were focused on road and the importance of transportation and road as heritage. But both historically and contemporary fishing is the most important activities in the area. And during last decade, it went under big transformation because of exceptionally warm summers of recent years, also COVID restrictions to international travel, and then with the Russian invasion to Ukraine, all the international angling tourism that flourished here in post-Soviet times, it's cancelled, and now this region became mostly the region for internal tourism. There's also another important transformation is that the Russian government recently declared the international conservation NGOs like World Wildlife Foundation, for instance, they've been declared as an undesirable organization, and all the activities for salmon conservation that were handled by this foundation in particular are ceased now. So the future of conservation has become very much uncertain, and as economic difficulties also grow, the nature might not be the last to suffer. Those tourists who do not fish hope to have also some spiritual experience in a natural landscape, rocky coast, dark forests, rolling rivers, and seascapes especially evoke the sublimes. All tourists, regardless of motivations, pass along the same road in search for their desired experiences. For tourists, the most important features of the road is its striking open sea panoramas, which are not very often in Russia. Oceanic views are not that common in the European part of Russia. And so, especially with the big tides, you know, when the littoral became open and, you know, you can also watch some sea life, which is not very rich in the White Sea, but still it's a marine environment. Yeah, as yeah, the next slide, please. And what we discussed in the paper, in addition to this big road that is the main transportation infrastructure, we discussed also paths and eco-paths as some kind of a future of touristic developments that's going on now. And also we look to the remoteness as a heritage, where roadless been presented for tourists as a particular historical experience. And for that, for instance, this particular place, the Fish and Station Museum, that was organized in a way not very far from a small town, but on the other way there is no road and you need to go there along the littoral to coordinate your time with the time of the tide. And that's a very unique experience for tourists. And when you there are museum sites, there are dwelling sites where you can stay for several days, and there are no electricity, no Wi-Fi, so it's completely designed as a remote place with all the local heritage presented. And all this kind of networks of local roads and trails has shaped the tourist development process. They not only serve as a key part of mobility infrastructure, but also as a core element of local heritage that scattered and isolated tourist sites. And we highlight the central position of these roads and rails in the interactions of various groups of tourism. And yeah, and so the mobility of infrastructure of roads and trails generates a continuization as modes of access rapidly become key part of the tourist imaginary. A road built to meet local utilitarian needs, and it becomes an instrument of imagination and exploration for newcomers. And the last slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much. And these are the beautiful landscapes, and it's so much a pity that, you know, you can't visit it now, and even we who are relocated out of Russia because of the war situation, we can't visit the place, and we very much longing for it, and, you know, I very much miss the place.
Thank you so much, Julia. That's great. And I had to say with joy, we have Jonas on the line. So if we bring up Jonas's PowerPoints, please, and hopefully, Jonas, if you are there.
I am here. Give me a second. I'll stop the video on. So hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. It's just on similar tracks as we can see in this picture, but it's beautiful, sunny -14 degrees day here where I am, and so I decided to come back inside and introduce the paper where I, Anna-Maria Walter, and Jonathan Carruthers-Jones examined the interactions between humans and wildlife, which are facilitated by snow during winter snow activities. And with this study, I think one of the most fascinating things, and maybe you can put the next slide, thank you. What I found most fascinating with this study is that here, despite the fact that we started with our research questions we had set in the research proposal, in the end, it was the field itself that said to us, so what is that we are looking for, and what are the research topics that that are interesting. And in our study, we focused on 3 different areas. Firstly, focusing on cross-country skiing in Lahemaa National Park, Estonia, where I did my field work. Anna Maria Walter focused on German Alps and alpine touring, and Jonathan Curtis Jones looked what's happening in northern Sweden and Finland and focusing on cross-country touring. And as we were practicing those activities ourselves, in the same time also doing interviews with people who were participating, we discovered, in a sense, that these tracks that people create on the snow create a unique form of connection between humans and animals. And we try with our paper to emphasize the transient and often indirect nature of these interactions. And in this short presentation, I would like to maybe bring out a number of findings that we brought together. Firstly, as I already said, snow tracks became sort of like our central for our research, and we use snow as a dynamic medium to record, but also something that really quickly erase the interspecies interactions, and this is probably one of the most unique aspects of this paper, where not only the landscape but the snow on the landscape becomes a mediator in order to see those interactions in the landscapes. And through that, it highlights how human activities, especially skiing in our case, temporarily intersect with animal movements, creating momentary non-encounters. Also, with our study, we focus on the sensory and imaginary dimensions of interspecies encounters. Instead of direct human-animal interactions, in our study, we see how seeing animal tracks fosters imagined encounters. Often the people we interviewed, we skied with, they hadn't had those direct interactions. Instead, the interactions always came through seeing tracks on the snow, but not only animal tracks, but also tracks of other skiers, other hikers, which created imagined encounters. They may never see animals, but still become aware of their presence through the traces that are left behind. And this shifts human perception of nature. We suggest in our paper that winter sports enthusiasts develop a deeper or different connection with the landscape through tracking, even if it happens unintentionally. And this questions whether these indirect encounters can foster greater ecological awareness and responsibility. And this is definitely one thing that we would like to delve deeper in further studies to see if really those indirect encounters can create those better ecological awareness and responsibility. Also, winter landscapes become spaces of coexistence. Unlike summer landscape, where human presence may dominate, snow-covered environments we found create temporary records of those multi-species movement. And we emphasize that winter sports are not just recreational activities, and winter sports areas, whether there are natural parks or alpine tour areas, they are not just recreational spaces, but shared habitats with animals. And this really, overall, to bring it together, we see that as we have brought together anthropology, environmental studies, and human geography, we try to bring attention to the overlooked role of snow in human-environment relations, and why not even ice, as I just encountered a few hours ago. Previous research on interspecies relations has often focused on forest, farms, or urban settings, while snow as a medium for interspecies engagement has been underexplored, and we find that definitely that can be something to delve deeper in future. And the next slide is thank you slide, and I thank you Eva and Caroline for bringing this webinar together, and I welcome you to read the special issue, and if you have any further questions, then please contact either Anna Maria or me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas, and hopefully you can stay to take questions and answers, which we're hoping for after we've all presented. On the schedule, I am next. My name is Eva Bergland, and I'm speaking to you from Southern England. I'm currently visiting researcher at University of Sussex, but I did the work that I'm going to talk about now as a researcher at the University of Oulu. Is my slides up there? Yep. But after I leave Sussex, I shall be going back to Finland, where I'm working part-time in the design department. But my background is in anthropology, and I very much came to this project from that background. And I ended up writing about something which I call dwelling in unsustainability, and based on fieldwork halfway up the Finnish-Russian border, there you see on the map, which is remote in a particular, slightly different way of being remote from Lapland, because Lapland has a very vibrant tourism sector. Here, halfway up the country, it's a slightly overlooked part of the country, and it's very much in the news, if at all, as a place that's declining, is losing population, is being left behind. And a lot of my work is really curious about the spatial imaginaries that sustain those kinds of narratives, how those narratives change. And then while I was in the field, I really became aware of the role of the landscape itself having a role in those spatial imaginaries. And to just quickly sketch the situation, it's a part of the country which has had nature tourism promoted for about 40 years now. And the most successful, or at least the most prominent kind of nature tourism, is photographing wild animals. So overseas tourists are invited to spend the night in a hide and take their chances on sighting a bear, a wolf, a wolverine, and so on. So that's a spatial imaginary that's very much like the tourist gaze, but it comes into conflict with local experiences, of course, which involve fear for these kinds of animals and the problems that are faced by people who own domestic animals. And I became interested, you can show the next slide, in how the spatial imaginaries in this place are kind of work at different scales from different perspectives and are dynamic over time. And one of the things that I became completely obsessed with was forest roads. I think the local people that I was working with were quite aware that I wanted to see forest roads, I wanted to know about them. And I first encountered them because they are crucial to the tourism. Without forest roads, there are no hides. And yet it is quite apparent, and there's a lot of research on the role of forest roads as part of the extractive history of the forest industries. And it's those forest industries that were actually part and parcel of everyday life, but also a growing economy until about the 1970s and 80s, at which point tourism was promoted as an alternative, something to replace lost livelihoods, lost incomes. And why this was an obvious place for landscape research to give me inspiration was because the wilderness turned out not to be a wilderness. It was very much a peopled landscape, very much a managed, designed landscape. And interestingly, people that I encountered in different ways were able to read that landscape in very different ways. And they were able to tell me, this is where there's been a farmstead, this is where there's been a particular way of coppicing. And they didn't mostly mind if the landscape that's actually peopled is sold as a wilderness, because after all, it's just business. So that was a sort of perspective, if you like, on the landscape, which is very different according to the different kinds of people that I spoke to. So if you show the next slide, again, looking for inspiration of how to deal with this, I went to my old hero, Tim Ingold, and his dwelling perspective, and once again found that it's a little bit problematic in the way that it tends to romanticize a particular pre-modern kind of environment and landscape. And here there are two images of a landscape that you will find in many parts of this part of Finland, the straight roads. But mostly those straight roads were built after the war, after the Second World War, and they were very much something that people wanted. And now they are actually symbols of perhaps the backwardness, not only in other economic terms, but in sustainability terms, as viewed from people outside the region, who tend to see these regions as somehow sustainability backward, not as green as they should be. But if we look at the histories of infrastructures, we see that the infrastructure there on the right, which looks very organic, looks kind of pre-modern, is actually also part of the extraction, the history of extracting forest and wood from this part of the country. And this has basically been for me the beginning of an absolutely wonderful experience of looking into the histories of infrastructures and the way that they are embodied and embedded in local livelihoods in completely different ways, and how the landscape research tradition gives me the tools to think about how these kinds of spatial imaginaries change over time and who is included in what imaginary and in what capacity, whether as somebody who is pushing forward new ways of thinking and doing and perhaps living in a sustainable way, as many people here are, because they're actually not as wealthy as a lot of people in the south of Finland. But also, unfortunately, this is the next slide, in the sense of being left behind with infrastructure that may or may not have a future. And with that, I look forward to lots more research and publications from myself on this. I really found this an exciting way to get into a new area. Thank you very much. And now I suppose Carolyn and
Yes.
I are...
Apologies, yes. Yes, I'm just waiting for the slide to come up. Yeah, so the paper that I have contributed to our special issue is titled "What's in a Landscape? Nature, Memory and Tourism in Bitterfeld-Wolfen's Post-Mining Landscape in East Germany." I have conducted that research at the Rachel Carson Center at the University of Munich. Yeah, thank you. So the way how I came to this project is interesting because it is linked to my personal upbringing. And that is that before the Contos project came into being, I was asked about an amber deposit in a mine in Bitterfeld, which is an area like 30 kilometers from where I grew up. And I was very much sure that that there was no amber ever mined in that area because I grew up there and I never heard about it. But it turns out that I was actually wrong, and that there was quite, during the socialist times of East Germany, that there was quite an important deposit of amber that was also mined. And moreover, it was mined, or the deposit was located in a huge open cast lignite mine that also I knew nothing about. And so this is how I became actually interested in this area, because first it was related to my home region, and I just realized that I knew not much about it. So growing up in the 1990s in Eastern Germany, I've spent my summers at so-called excavation lakes. This is how we refer to them. And this was a designation that I never really thought about. I never really bothered to think where this designation of excavation lakes came from. And so the inquiry that I received of what's about this amber mine in Bitterfeld was really the beginning of my also ethnographic inquiry into my home region, its history. So, and this started with my actually genuine question of what has been in this landscape and what is in this landscape. And this led me soon to the study of the history of open cast brown coal mining there, and also the chemical industry that was located in this Bitterfeld-Wolfram region. It was the third biggest chemistry industry in the GDR in Eastern Germany. And then also to look into the consequences that are felt until today. So in July 2021, I visited for the first time the so-called Great Gotcha Lake that had been created from the former mine of the same name. Can I have this is the mine that you see here in this picture. Can we see the next slide? And in the process of the restoration of the mine, the lake and its surroundings have also been recast as a destination for nature tourism, offering recreational activities alongside natural beauty and tranquility. The picture that you see here in the slide casts the moment or the period when the mine or the former pit was flooded. That took a number of years. And this kind of tower that you see, it's called the water level tower and has become like a landmark to remind of the mining history, but also to point at its future now as a tourism attraction. However, in July 2021, the idyllic lakeland that was now spread out in front of me did not easily align with the images of environmental destruction and pollution that I had found during my research in the not so recent past. And moreover, many of the elderly interlocutors that I had interviewed seemed to respond to the same contrast. Their comments on the beautiful present were often accompanied by reflections about a past when people suffered from toxic fumes and coal dust, but also enjoyed a solid base for their livelihoods, as well as a reliable social fabric that was appreciated in many ways. So once conversations with my interlocutors had moved into the past, they often went on to describe their personal experiences of the profound political, economic, and utterly social ruptures that were brought about by the German reunification 30 years ago, and in many ways ongoing. Thus, guided by this recurrent comparison and narrative, I decided to explore in my paper how environmental destruction and landscape restoration became inextricably linked to the socio-political transformation of the region in the context of German reunification, and how this was experienced by inhabitants of the Bitterfeld-Wolfram region. And to sum up here's a summary of my findings, and that is that in the context of reunification, the successfully restored landscape acquired a particular meaning beyond its ecological recovery. And that is that at the time, public discourse fostered a stigma around the pollution in the region by delegating the responsibility for environmental destruction to local inhabitants. This further resonated with the broader devaluation of East German subjectivities vis-à-vis their West German counterparts, which was a bias that shaped German reunification as a whole in many ways. So in this light, ecological recovery became also to represent a kind of rehabilitation of the region itself, at least as it was felt by locals. And this was achieved not at least as the region became envisioned and curated as a destination for nature tourism, creating the largest possible contrast to a past of environmental degradation and high levels of chronic diseases due to pollution. And so I think I'll leave it at that and pass the word on to our last speaker, Lydia Rahmanova.
Thank you so much. So I'm very grateful for being here and presenting together with this great team of a special issue. And today, to introduce my paper, I would like to tell a little bit about the challenges of my methodology and the intriguing surprise, the researcher's surprise that I had at the beginning of my work. So I'm social anthropologist, and before the start of our joint project, I already was in my Siberian field in Western Siberia on the Ob River banks for like since 2016. And what is more important, before this, I also launched the research on Solovki Island, a White Sea, very close to what Alexei Kraikovsky and Yulia Laius also made a field research on. And both of my field sites are connected with political repressions, with the Solovetsky Islands camp and forced resettlers, whose memorialization is under review in my article. And so actually, I made my research in sphere of informal economies, that is hunting and fisheries and poaching, doing fishing trips with my informants already, having shared their labor practices. But there was really a challenge for me how to study tourism in this remote area. Plus, I understood that this is actually not a geographical frontier, so it's not a coast of some ocean, but it's just in the middle of the country. But it's a remote frontier, which is of certain interest for me. So how to conceptualize a frontier in the heart of the country, how to look at the rewilding and wildness, if it's the most desired thing that is sold to tourists, and how it is connected with a political meaning of non-human agents. So I asked myself, how could I start again a new research, not doing poaching together with my informants, but coming into relationship with these multi-layered agencies like river. And so my article is devoted mainly to the voice of the river, to how river speaks, to how river acts, and maybe looking at Eduardo's con, how forests think, I would ask how rivers remember. And so my thus, I tried to look at the museums because I was too much in fisheries. So the next slide will show you the part of the permanent exhibition in the Soviet and post-Soviet museum, Kalpashevo Museum in Tomsk region. And I show here the part of it. Actually, it was opened in December 1978, just 1.5 years before a great Kalpashevo tragedy, which I'll introduce a little bit later. And here you see a very interesting, intriguing section. It is called The Work of the River, Работа реки in Russian. And actually, you see the photograph on the left-hand side and this exhibition tells us about economics of this region. And I wondered, what else does Riva do, actually? What is her work? And that was my take, which I was inspired from the language that this Soviet exhibition uses to represent something. But how does these special imaginaries and perceptions of new tourists that come there, how do they read actually this exposition? I asked myself. And now, if we trace to the next slide, we'll see this big picture from the exhibition on the left-hand side from Kalpashevo Museum. And I would like to say that in 1979, a tragedy happened. So it was a place where lots of people were repressed and shot. And just in half a year after the exhibition was set, and it was so beautiful, the bodies of shot people were out of the landscape. And actually, the river showed and revealed historical truth through her work. And on the right-hand side, you can see the memorial on a tree devoted to these repressed people. But unfortunately, actually, in years after, river also ruinized this part of the bank of the river where this tree stand. So river revealed historical truth at first and repressions, but it also stopped these memorialization practices that was possible due to this memorial. So this was an intrigue of different things, of different revelations that oppose the whole framework of conservation. And I'm trying to show that conservation has so many layers and meanings, and actually ruinization, post-sovereignty ruinization, has something to do with revealing the voice of non-human actors in historical and memorialization process. So that's my point, and thank you for your attention. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, so much. We'll shortly be moving to Q&A, and while the audience gathers together any thoughts, I do have a question for our speakers today, but and feel free to put questions in the chat, or in the next half hour, just raise your hand, we'll pick them up. But we did ask for the speakers to think of what they thought were the surprises that were most generative in this project, and we thought we'd answer in the order that you spoke. So Alessandro, if you could respond to this, or somehow react to this question of what kinds of productive surprises did you find in the process?
My very insightful answer, perhaps, is that no. I mean, the main. It's a confirmation more than anything that the best sort of academic work comes out of collaborations, right? And I mean, perhaps for me it was, you know, in a sense, when you think through landscapes, you tend to be very place specific, and I guess you should be, right? You know, and to look at very sort of unique, specific, particular characteristics embodied and embedded, and so on and so forth, and historical. But you know, then you sort of speak comparatively with someone who works in northern Finland, you know, a place that, you know, until a couple of years ago I had never visited, and then suddenly you're like, oh yeah, no, it's kind of similar where I'm from. Oh, that's very different. Oh no, well, actually, let me think about it. And then, you know, these kind of questions come up, and then you start looking at a place through a very different lens, such as tourism. For me, wasn't really, I never really worked on tourism, and I wasn't really thinking through those lenses, but by thinking through it and through other people's work and experiences, I think it revealed something, at least it did to me. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. So Julia, do you have something to share?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, for us, it was a very new type of work, because previously we worked mostly as a historians, either environmental historians, but still we visited places. We like place-based work, but we never did interviews, and we never looked on landscapes and history of landscapes from the point of view of tourism gaze. So I'm very grateful for this new approach, new gaze, and I second Alessandra that, you know, you think that you study something unique, but then you see a lot of parallels to other places. And also this multi-species thing, the multi-species approach, which is becoming more and more important nowadays in academy. And I start to think more about that than I used to do before. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Caroline, I guess you would be next in line, since Jonas has left us for the ski trail, I think.
Sure. I think for me, as a trained anthropologist, social cultural anthropologist, history has always been important to understand origins of the presence, where I am mostly working empirically. Now, the histories that we have mobilized within this project, they have been very different. And I think what I learned most is to what extent these histories are not just a backdrop. They do not just give a temporal depth, but actually something that is not just the origin of a present that has been shaped by certain historical circumstances, but how history just continue to shape present configurations, say, or how actively histories are engaged in the present in various ways in the same place. So coming back to what Alessandro just said, this focus on the place is one thing, but then there are multiple histories, even though it is maybe one landscape and one history. But the way they are engaged in the present varies, and with that also the way landscapes are envisioned and also engaged. This is certainly also something that we have within the research group that we have been working with, especially pushed by our historically trained colleagues, as you just introduced yourself, and also Alexei. So yeah, I guess I would say that. And now I give it back to you, Eva.
I have a very short answer to this, which is that I'm surprised in hindsight by how excited we critical social scientists and humanities people became about this multi-species term and concept, when for decades it's been so obvious to scholars in many other fields, in geography and ecology and elsewhere. Of course we're multi-species. And I feel like I'm sort of at the beginning of something that where I have to go into the past to really understand that and to learn new things. And I wondered, Lydia, if you could also comment on this, the element of surprise, before we open it up for questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. So I have 2 points to say. Firstly, that actually it was the project about not only conservation, but important things like infrastructures, remoteness and non-remoteness, and connectivity as an opposition, and dealing with what Carolyn said just in the beginning of the presentation. I would like to say that for me it was a great experience of solidarity and the challenge, and actually a chance to continue contribution and teamwork, while some new barriers, some new frontiers, and some new types of remoteness, like academic ruptures, were counted just during the launch of our project. And so for me, the very thing that it was a great montage of different perspectives together in one special issue, it's an experience of solidarity. And secondly, this is a great inspiration of using different languages, not only academic one, but visual, photograph, video, audio. And this was inspired by that we launched this website together. And now I'm taking this inspiration to teach, to lecture students in Russia within different languages, involving not only just simply articles and monographs, but very interesting experiments. So thank you very much for this experience.
Thank you, Lydia. That's great to hear. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Landscape Research Journal and the Landscape Research Group, which has really been inspiring to us. And note that there is also material in the chat relating to that, resources. And open it up, really, I'm not seeing questions in the chat, but you are free to just raise your hands. Please don't take this as the moment to just switch off and go home.
Well, if anyone has got a question, feel free to put your hand up. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone. It's been incredibly interesting, and as Eva mentioned, I've shared a link in the chat where you can go to the article on our website where we talk about this event, and you'll find links to each of the articles in Landscape Research. So I would urge you to click on those links and read a little bit more about the research that you've heard today, and likewise to look into our trip to Cairo and being a part of our community as well, because we'd love to have you all as a part of it. And if you're in agreement, Eva, maybe we should wrap things up. Yeah. So
I'm in agreement. I think it's been a really great experience. And I think I do speak for all of us that it's been very constructive and generative. And for myself, that I think it's the beginning of a new way of thinking about the kinds of issues that we looked at. So thank you to the audience as well, and the kind words in the chat.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. Thank you very much for having been with us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days, mornings, evenings, wherever you are in the world. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.